G'day everybody, and for those who have come in late, you're listening to Expand the Phantom podcast.
Years ago, he washed ashore the sole survivor of a shipwreck, and upon the skull of the man who killed his dad, he said, "I'm mad, I must eradicate piracy, injustice and cruelty, and all my sons will follow me, so evildoers will believe that this man cannot die." The Phantom, the ghost who walks. The Phantom, enemies beware. The Phantom's always there, but you won't find the Phantom.
Hello, we are the Chronicle Chamber team, and this is Expand the Phantom podcast. Our website is chroniclechamber.com, and you can contact us via our email, which is chroniclechamber@gmail.com. You can subscribe to this via YouTube or via our iTunes, or if you're an Android user, the various Android apps as well. This is episode 180, The Phantom and Colour. My name is Jermayn, and as you can see, we are joined by a couple of us. Dan, how are you?
Good, Jermayn. Yes, happy to be sitting back on a Saturday night and talking about The Phantom, and I'm looking forward to learning some stuff today, I think.
Yes, yeah. This is going to be a fun episode, I think. First of all, we must say that this could be a good episode for if you normally listen to us via the podcast or via audio only. This could be a good episode to watch us on YouTube, because there's going to be lots of props, lots of images are going to show up on the screen and stuff like that. So, so just be prepared for that. We will do our best to explain it for those audio listeners as well, but we'll see how we go. So as you can see on the screen, if you're on our YouTube, but if not, we have 4 people today. We don't have Stephen. Stephen has the man flu and he has to start work. So we need to let him get better so he can actually go to work, so he can keep everyone happy and keep food on the table. So shout out to Stephen. Hope you feel better soon, buddy. But we are going across continents today. We've got 3 continents that are represented. So we've got Ankit, all the way from India. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Jermayn and Dan. I'm really thankful that you guys have me over here. And Kevin, his book was one of the first things I remember when I ever searched on Amazon.in. Like Phantom Unmasked came up right there. And so I'm looking forward to really learn a lot of stuff from you guys.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, we'll get to talk to you a little bit later on. But Kevin, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Jermayn. How are you?
Very good. So this is the second podcast that you've been on. You came back.
That's right. I'm a repeat offender now. That's it. It's official.
And we were just saying before we were recording too, Kevin, the difference in the world and in the podcast. Because last time you were on, you were promoting your book, The Phantom Unmasked. We're talking to you about that. And at the time, it was a dodgy telephone line from across the other side of the world. It's pretty scratchy. And
It was. It felt like a 1980s dial-up modem conference call. And now look at us. We're here in the future.
That's it. Okay, so as by the title, we've dubbed this The Phantom and Colour. Now, the reason why we have done this is because, let's be honest, every single day on social media, there's some well-meaning fan talking about the Phantom and how it needs to be in colour. In 2020, we had 2 fan Zoom catch-ups. And let's be honest, Ankit, you were in on both of those. Over a third of the time in both of those, it was discussed colour. So it kind of like, I'm listening to fans from around the world. I think we had fans from again, 4 continents. We had Europe, Asia, North America, South America, and Australia. And we all talked about colour again. So we thought we better do something about it. Now, it must be said, colour TV happened 50 plus years ago. So some people may wonder, why is the Frew comic still not in colour? And are Australians colourblind? To help us get a better, wider perspective, we've brought in 2 fans who know a lot more about comics from around the world, but also Australia, than myself and Dan. Myself and Dan, we're Phantom fans. Dan, did you
I
read
don't think
any
people
other?
are learning it.
Did you read any other comics apart from the Phantom when you grew up?
Yeah, I did. And this was before I was 10, probably for the most part. Like your Casper and Disney and Archie comics and that sort of thing, as well as Foot Rot Flats and that sort of stuff. Mostly at my granddad's place. But and then beyond that, since then, mostly almost exclusively the Phantom.
So were you a Veronica or Betty fan?
Betty.
Yeah, I was Betty as well. So, okay, that's the important stuff out of the way. So, as you can tell, myself and Dan are probably don't have the expertise to discuss the Phantom.
Well, we've got a limited experience. I guess it's we've only had access for the most part to Frews. I know you collect a lot of comics from around the world, Germ, but I certainly don't, and the average fan in Australia wouldn't. And I think that's given you a really good perspective. But we both grew up on Frews, and until you got to that stage you're doing that, all we saw was black and white. So, that's our learned expectation, I suppose.
Yes. So the reason why we've got Kevin and Ankit is purely so we can have a better perspective than just the two of us. So first of all, we're going to introduce Ankit. This is your chance to talk a little bit more about yourself, Ankit. We've got 2 minutes each. So basically, Ankit, for those who don't know, is our newest Chronicle Chamber contributor, and he reviews the Regal comics, which we really appreciate, Ankit. It's greatly appreciated by the three of us and everyone at Chronicle Chamber. So please, Ankit, if you can, tell us in 2 minutes your age, your history of the Phantom, brief history of other comics, and then to end it off, should Frew publish in colour?
Thank you guys.
That's more than 2 minutes.
I'm 32 years old. I'll turn 33 in March pretty soon. And my history with the Phantom is actually one of probably the first comic character that I read, which was not Indian, was the Phantom, and that was translated in Bengali in the strips in Anandabajar Putrika, which even now actually publishes the Phantom. So, and it was black and white, and I distinctly remember probably the first story I read was the Phantom Cowboy, because it was very distinct in my head that there were cowboy scenes, and there was a kissing scene, I think, in it. So as a kid, that kind of stuck there, because you don't, and back then in India you never saw people kiss on TV or anywhere. So the Phantom was there, and then I'm not actually from the Indrajal era. That is actually where my probably my uncles were, but I never. So I grew up actually on the Diamond comics, these in Bengali, and they were. You can see they were all in color, and so that was basically my introduction to Phantom. And over time, I used to pick up single, and with comics in general, I used to pick up single issues and other people's stuff. Like I even read Archie, as you said. My older cousin, sisters, and all, they had a lot of Archie stuff, then Casper. But it wasn't before I actually got the Spawn. I had got a single issue of the Spawn. I think it was issue 2 or something. And this was in a book fair where there were random single stack issues. That it just blew me away, because even compared to the Batman and all the other old stuff, and it was pretty mixed, because we used to get our comics almost quite 6, 7, 8 years after it had actually been published. And Spawn was what basically blew me away. It wasn't just the art; it was just the presentation of something. And ever since then, I've become more of a comic fan, and now in the last 10 years, I've actually become more of a collector after I started working.
Awesome.
And the most important thing, Frew must publish in color. They should, because that's what I really look forward to. And I am really impressed with the trade paperbacks, and I really want them to do them in color, single issues, everything in color.
Okay. And another important question, Team Betty or Team Veronica?
I actually did like Betty.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, thank you for telling us a little about yourself and that. Kevin, over to you. So Kevin joined us in episode 83. Sorry, Dan, did you have something to say?
I was just saying, I'm going to say that we should probably ask Kevin straight off the bat, Betty or Veronica, mate. We're going to get that question out of the road.
Look, I'm going to be the dissenter here. I'll say Veronica. I'm sorry. She just had an edge. You know, Betty's very wholesome and very pure. Veronica's got an edge. No.
Well,
Fair enough. It's good to have a bit of variety. So introducing Kevin, like I said before, he joined us in episode 83, who wrote the book. And this is one of the reasons why I thought you would be great, Kevin, is because in the book you touched upon the history of India, Sweden, and Australia, and the book was titled The Phantom Unmasked. So your turn. If you could just tell us a little bit about yourself in 2 minutes. If you don't want to tell us your exact age, you can give us an age range, and then we can kind of go from there.
That's all right. Yes, I'm 16 years old. No, obviously. No, because it's in video, there's no denying I'm 52 years old. I first began reading Phantom comics back in the late 1970s. I think my first issue was number 631, which would have been The Diamond Hunters. I remember the story vividly. And that's a classic Ray Moore black and white story from the mid to late 1930s. So I think for me, the Phantom has always been a black and white comic strip hero. I read the Phantom for many years and sort of, left the Phantom, and came back. He was probably one of the few comic book series that even if I left for a period of time, I'd always come back to. I'd always check out what was going on every few years to see what was happening with the Frew edition, especially when Jim Shepard took over in the late 80s onwards, when you saw a lot of new activity happening there. I did also grow up reading black and white Australian reprints of American comics, particularly the DC comic reprints that were published under the Planet Comics imprint here in Australia in the 1970s. So again, very much a black and white medium for Australian kids of my generation growing up in the 70s there. But also used to read imported British comics like Battle Picture Weekly and 2000 AD. Again, my preference really was for the dramatic adventure serial comic. I never was drawn to the humorous sort of cartoon humour comics of your Archies or your Casper or whatever. And in answer to the pressing question, should Frew publish in colour? I would say as necessary. I'm not a full convert on them publishing colour all the time. I am very much a product of my generation. So for me, the Phantom and by extension, the Frew editions of the Phantom in Australia should always in my heart remain black and white. But I can understand the need to publish in colour, and some of the work they've released lately, like the colour special editions they've produced, have been really impressive. So I think if there's a demand for it, and if it can help bring new readers into the Phantom fold, then yes, absolutely they should publish in colour, but not too often.
Fair enough. Well, appreciate that, Kevin. And guys, I hope the listeners have learned a bit about you and stuff like that. So, Dan, we're going to start this off, and then we're going to go to the experts. So, Dan, where do you yourself stand regarding the Phantom and colour? And on top of that, Frew and colour.
I think Kevin and I are going to probably agree on quite a lot of stuff tonight, and I think he's just outlined my point of view far more eloquently than I could. I was nodding along with everything you said there, Kevin, about, traditionally I do enjoy my Frew in black and white. It's what I've grown up on, but by the same token, there is a growing expectation that people get colour as well. And sometimes, and I enjoy a good colour story. I don't mind the American comics or anything like that. So it's not like I've got anything against colour. But I also have no problem at all with black and white. And I guess that might be a bit of a difference for some people who who just can't, who really want the color, because it's what they're used to.
No worries. So you've grown up on black and white comics, and then in the last 5 years you've seen some Frew comics in color. What are your opinion of the Frew comics in color? Do you are you liking those stories? Does it add a new element? Is the color not good enough, or like, just tell us a bit about that.
Well, for me, the way I read a comic book is mostly for the story. There are people who can flick through the artwork and not read a word of the dialogue and really enjoy that as a book. And there's I'm far more of a dialogue reader and a story follower in that sense. And so to me, if the color will help with the mood, I guess, of the story, if the artist has used that to help with the mood, and it's not just color for the color's sake, but it's the colorist, I guess, has got to work the hardest in a way to contribute to the story rather than just contribute to the art, if you know what I mean. And for me, it's about the story. So I could take it or leave it. Is basically where I'm at. I like what Frew are doing at the moment in terms of publishing some color from time to time, but I don't think I think they're getting the balance pretty much right. I know we were light on last year, which there was only one Frew edition used any color in 2020, but we've already seen one in 2021. So I think that I think they're getting the balance a little about right. Maybe 4-6 color issues per year might be about right for me, I think.
No worries. Kevin, Ankit, anything you just want to add or comment what Dan just said?
In terms of what I've seen of the colour that's coming out of Frew publications in Australia, probably the first one I saw was when they reissued the Ray Moore story, The Skyband, in a colorized format with the Billy Zane Phantom cover. And I thought that was actually really well done. I thought the color palette that they used was very muted, and I thought it complemented the artwork tremendously well, because Ray Moore's early work on the Phantom in the 1930s is very much a product of black and white comic strip illustration of that era. It's very shadowy. There's lots of dark tones. And I thought the colouring that they used in that example was really well done. I thought it added an extra dimension. The colours weren't too vibrant. They weren't too loud. They were almost muted. And I think that sort of palette worked really well. The few other examples I've seen of the colour Frew editions, and it's mainly been online, I don't have access to them here in America, have struck me as being really good. I think the recent Frew annual edition is a collection of the newspaper strips, a collection of 4 American daily newspaper strips printed in colour. I think that's a really, an excellent idea. I think that's a really exciting development. I think the fact that in recent years, over in Australia, a lot of the News Limited newspapers around the country have been running the Daily Phantom strip in colour, means that you have a whole generation of Australian readers who've grown up reading the Phantom comic strip in colour as well. And I think the colouring on the contemporary American strip is very good. I think it's very thoughtful colouring. I think it's very moody and atmospheric as the story requires it. It's not garish like if you ever see the comic strip supplement from an American Sunday newspaper, it's usually just this explosion of colour. But the Phantom, I think, is comparatively restrained, and especially when a lot of the action takes place at night or at dusk, I think the artist is really using colour very intelligently in a way that really complements the story.
And I think that's so important for me, that the colorist has actually read the story and knows the character and understands that palette that suits.
It's not always perfect, because Lee Falk was coloured as a darker person than what he was. But by the most of all, it is good. For me, one of the issues that I have is that if it has to be in color, the quality has to be good. Like it was the second or maybe the third Frew issue that they ever did in color was it was the Moonstone story by Lou Manor, and the colors. And I remember we talked about this in our comic news review. The colors were very dark and muddy in a sense, and maybe it's the paper, and we can talk about how color needs to be on better paper and all that. But if it just looks like you're reading the comic and you got sunglasses on, I think it actually takes away from the comic than if you don't. Like I look at so this is a Diamond comic here which I've got up. So this is Diamond comic number 87, and it's Little Baldy, which is a Sunday story. So it originally was done for color. These colors, like what Kevin was talking about before, they're very simple colors, but they match well. And I think with newspaper stories, and I'll be interested in hearing what you guys have to say, that kind of brings me to something else. Is a lot of the older readers we've seen newspaper stories. We've got 10 issues of them, 20 issues, 30 issues of the same story. Is it time for Frew to maybe do like what they did with the Cyban and actually publish those and print those in color? And that will that be something new that maybe Frew could do? So just be interested in if they are to reprint old newspaper stories, should they be in color, or especially maybe even the Sunday stories where they were originally intended in color. So so I know there's a bit to digest there, but any thoughts on that, guys?
Yeah, I would like to say one thing, like continuing with the Frew stuff, the only Frew color, full color stuff that I have are the trade paperbacks. And I was introduced to them with the first one, but I think second one, there is a story which is a normal newspaper strip, the slave market of Nukar. I have it. Yeah, same book, that one. Now, if you check out the thing that Kevin was talking about was how the art style, like how Remu's art style was well complemented in doing the Skyban. Similarly, if you look the color palette used by, I think Mr. Evan Pedersen.
Yes.
It was also very muted because the most important thing a lot of people don't realize is it's not just the color. It's the main thing that you need is the inking. It's the inking that sets the tone for what kind of color, which is why when you talked about, the full circle story, Lou Manna, the thing is, when you see, I don't know if I'm getting his name right, Lou Manna, right?
Yep.
Yes, so his general style of inks is very strong. So on top of that, when you do not put the right kind of, I won't say palette, more like the right kind of hues, it is going to make things look a little bit like as if you've put sunglasses on your eyes while reading them. Whereas when you see what Mr. Evan has done with this story itself, you will see that how well he's incorporated the inks into his each. It's a very simple color if you look at it. It's very simple. It doesn't have too many hues. It's not using lighting gradients and all to it is a product of its time. It's like a very well recolored version of the kind of stuff that Marvel and DC are putting out by their the old Silver Age omnibuses and everything. They are digitally recolored, and to be very honest, I am not a big fan of all the recolors, but some of them, whoever done like recently there was a Batman Tales of the Demon which came out, which somehow kept Neil Adams' original inks intact while doing a very nice version of, literally I would say, a facelift of the original colors. It's not the recolor, but when you buy the same thing on a trade paperback, of the Tales of the Demon, you will see that it's completely different. Colors are completely different. So that is one of the things. The fear of recoloring something is understanding the story and the base inks and the art that you have, because not every artist, his sketchy style or somebody is very strong with their lines, colors are going to go completely different with it. And more importantly, back in the day when something was produced for black and white, people kept that in their mind. Just like if you see Jeff Weigel, the way he did the art for Duncan Munro's story, you can understand Weigel, the way he does colors for the Sunday's Phantoms, is not the way he's doing the same art for the actual story, because he's already realized that Frew is going to put this in complete black and white. So his gradient work, his line work, and his inking, most importantly, is completely different. So that is why I think so. But with the way Ivan has done work here, I think Frew are in very good hands, because I think Ivan also did the work for the Skyband story. Did he? Isn't he the colorist?
Yes.
So, and he's also a guy who really knows the Phantom lore very well.
Yes.
He's exactly the right guy for paints, I think, because he's also a very traditionalist. If you see, he likes traditional stories, he likes traditional folk. He's not very modern that way, but he's also a big advocate of color. So I think for a guy like him, if he does colors for Frew, I think Frew will do a fantastic job if they reprint every.
Ivan makes Dan look like a postmodernist.
and I agree with everything you said there too, Ankit, because Ivan, because he's that traditionalist, he knows that palette intimately, and I agree, he's the right person for those traditional stories. By the same token, though, you wouldn't probably have him colouring a modern story. He wouldn't touch it anyway, so that'd be fine.
Well, he did. In saying that, he did do the story in the Princess Sin story, and the Princess Sin trade paperback, which is about to come out, and also the I think he did the colours in the Triads Part 6 as well, I believe.
Oh,
so yeah, but in saying that, I think we will all agree that his colour palette choice for the daily stories is absolutely amazing. Like, he also did, for those who are on YouTube, you'll be able to see this. For those on the audio, I'm looking at the second trade paperback, which is The Man Who Cannot Die. That's the one that had the original newspaper stories and then the sequels. So he also did the colours for the movie stars as well, which is a daily story. And it's the same type of thing. It's, if anything, the colours are probably even more flatter and muted than the slave market of the Muka, which is probably got something to do with the fact that it's another 10, 15 years older. So I think we've talked about newspaper stories, and I think we've all agreed that if we are to republish the newspaper stories in colour, it needs to be the right colour palette for that.
Well, it makes like Kevin's right. They were initially produced in colour, certainly the Sundays. So there are clearly colour scans out there. One of the things in terms of must Frew publish in cover, you can't tell. There's obviously a business model underpinning all of this as well, and colour costs money. At least these Sundays are already coloured. You don't necessarily need to pay a colorist. Maybe a touch up or a facelift, or like what Ankit was saying, sounds good, but you might be able to keep the costs down. And this is where I suppose we should have had an artist or a colorist on to help us with this. But how long? What do you charge to color a comic? What would you be prepared to pay someone to sit there and color a 32-page story, a 22-page story? That's factored into the business costs. Then there's the extra cost of printing and all the rest of it. The color, the Jason Paulus story, the most recent one from 2021, issue 1, from this year, was $5.50 cover price, and the regular Frews are $3.75. So they're the same page count, but there's the extra cost. People are going to pay that? Are people going to be happy with the extra price? That's a factor that Frew have got to consider as well.
Okay, so it's about a $2 difference. or $1.75 or whatever. So we'll say $2 because that's easier for us maths challenged people. Like, did you see it as a problem, Dan, in paying an extra $2 for that story to be in colour?
Well, I'm a subscriber, so I didn't notice the cost.
Yeah.
But and I actually had to go back and look it up because it's not certainly something that I was surprised at when I got to the newsagent. So no, it is answer your question. If the Frew renewing my subscription suddenly went up by $150 or $200, or whatever the comparable would be, I'd certainly notice that, and I'd have to consider subscribing for that extra cost. So
yeah, and I guess a lot of, and we've discussed this on the podcast before, a lot of Phantom fans. If you were to look at, sorry, not Phantom fans, if you were to look at Frew readers, and I'm not sure, Kevin, if you actually have pure numbers or something that you can actually help make my point or refute it, but
Sure.
I would say that majority of Frew readers are of your generation, Kevin.
Look, I think certainly when Jim Shepard took over as publisher and managing director of Frew in the late 80s and early 90s, one of the things he did at that time was to do a reader survey, because I think the previous owners of Frew, the founding owners, had a certain conception in their mind that their readers were basically, prepubescent to middle adolescent, 12 to 15-year-olds. And he actually discovered that the readership was much older. It was like, 30 and 40 years upwards were the regular readers. And that was where the real growth was. So it's very much a sort of nostalgic fixture for a lot of, for readers, Australian readers at that time. But there was growth in the sort of readers in the 20-year-old, in the 20s age bracket as well. I don't know if that's changed or if that's remained constant over time. I don't know since, pardon me, since Glenn Ford and Renee White took over the company in 2016, I don't know if you've seen a change in that demographic. I certainly have no insight on that, but I think that's the beauty of the Frew edition of the Phantom. And I don't know, Ankit, if you sense this is also true of the Phantom in India as well, that it's probably one of the few comics that I think speaks to a cross-generational audience. Because it's been around so long, it will speak to older readers who remember it from their childhood some decades past. And it will also speak to newer, younger readers, such as yourself, who have a very different experience of reading the Phantom. Like, your first exposure to the Phantom is going to be very different to, say, what your aunts and uncles' exposure was to the Phantom. What you said, I think, was really good when you called them the Indrajal generation, whereas you're the Diamond Comics generation as well. And I think that same experience applies in Australia and in Sweden. And that's, I think, one of the really unique aspects of the Phantom, is that it has managed to retain such a loyal readership, which literally spans generations. I don't think there are very many comic book characters being published in the world today for so long that can make that same claim.
So in following up that, do you think that's, while I see it as a blessing, do you also think it could be a curse in the sense that Frew have to cater for such a large, wide market where, for instance, your generation, no offense, Kevin, grew up on the black and white and liked the black and white, where if you're, and this is purely stereotype, so I'm sorry if you fall outside, anyone of our listeners fall outside of the stereotypes, but if you're, say, a 10 to a 30-year-old, you'll probably prefer colour, and then if you're in between, you'll probably could kind of live with either, as long as it's a good story and stuff like that. So is that a bit of a problem for Frew in the sense that they have to cater for all of those?
I think it's been a perennial challenge for Frew because they've been conscious of the fact they have such a diverse, multi-generational audience. But I remember it's what Jim Shepherd said to me once in an interview. He said, you know, he said Frew has such an eclectic menu of stories to offer its readers, and it seems to please the vast majority of readers. And I think that's the beauty of it, because the strip dates back to 1936, it has such a rich archive of material. Frew has such a rich archive of material they can draw on, not just from America, but also from Sweden and Italy as well. And plus, even now, you know, we have a small growing body of Australian drawn stories as well, too. So I think, and also the fact that it's published on such a frequent basis every 2 weeks, I think gives them a chance. They probably have a better chance of being all things to all readers, of being able to cater to all those diverse reader tastes over the course of a publishing year than, say, Marvel or DC, who tend to release, 4 or 6 part miniseries in full color, and that's it. I think the Frew's publishing model lends itself to that diversity of output because it has such a diverse readership, and I think they're probably better placed than most other publishers to cater to that, such a divergent audience.
You'll be pleased to know, Kevin, that the data backs you up, because we've just done a best of 2020 survey through the website, and there was something like 80 separate stories published across all of the Frew issues, and there was only 4 from memory that didn't get any votes in people's top 5 stories for the year. So they're hitting a lot of marks. Someone or a few people out there are enjoying every single story. So they're diversifying really well, I think, in that regard.
Yeah,
and
I
likewise
think
with the covers.
Yeah, I think
No,
lately.
Likewise with the covers and the issues. Sorry, the votes were spread. Sorry.
No. I think you're absolutely right. I think they are hitting the mark. When I was recently in Australia for a period of a few months in the second half of last year, I actually got a chance to reacquaint myself with the Frew edition of the Phantom, and just seeing, the changing cover design and cover artwork, and just seeing the types of story they were publishing. I think, they've taken what the kind of model that Jim Shepherd was establishing in the 80s. They've really amplified that to such a way that I hope that this is reflected in the sales of the comic, that they are hitting all those marks, that the majority of the stories are appealing to a vast majority of readers. Yeah.
Ankit, anything you want to add, buddy?
The thing I realize is with Frew is it's still predominantly an Australian market. Frew is not really catering to the international customers as such. Right now, with the pandemic and all, I realized last year, the comic book market hasn't actually closed down, but it actually opened up much more. Because people are sitting at home. You should see the sales of collected editions and everything. That it's crazy. It wasn't like this. So, in a way, right now, Frew has, and because of also Regal Publishing right now, suddenly there is a huge Indian audience aware of what Frew is now. Now there is a huge issue. Like I'll tell you, I am part of like some comic WhatsApps group, which are like which we basically buy and trade and stuff from each other. So Regal had recently made the announcement that they are going to bring some Frew issue, and they had like it basically got shared into the group by someone. And most of the guys over there were like, "What? So expensive, black and white." Like that was their first reaction. Initially, they were very thrilled. Like they had no idea about Frew. So like they're seeing new covers, new stories, new Phantom. Like it's like completely a new world for them. But when they see the prices, they're like, okay. And then when they see the price and then black and white associated with it, they just can't make sense of it. because they are, and even like we in India, I'll tell you more importantly, like after Spawn I changed, but there was a period in the early 2000s when not early, I say mid 2000s, when there was a company from India. They called themselves Gotham Comics. They got the license to print almost like any Dark Horse, and they were printing Batman, Superman, all of them first, like in larger. Then for the business model, they made it smaller, and those were like the actual like foreign comics issues that was became widely available to the public, and that is probably what my generation and the slightly next few generations of mine got acquainted with. And the sad part is the Phantom got complete at that period of time, was going through like a publishing like a zero. There was nothing happening on the Phantom front. It was much later again when Eurokids and Egmont India tried to bring it out, but the damage I would say was done because the Phantom was still like 20 years behind to what was being put out. Even with Gotham doing, and Gotham was really cheap. It was like 20 rupees, which is less than I think 50 cents for you guys, something. So it was like it was cheap. It was color. It was all the things that people had heard about, and Wikipedia wasn't available. Nothing was available. So these things, so people were actually looking forward to know and get to know. And Phantom at that point of time was still relegated to the newspaper strip, and because Diamond was not publishing anything. And when you were, and also if you see, the Phantom stories modernized themselves with time. Whereas in India, we kept on publishing the daily and the Sundays from Saiberry era. So it was a very, or even Olesen and Williams probably, but it was very limited. So after a point of time, if you keep reprinting the same stories, people are going to get tired. They already know what's up. And so that way, what happened was that market got very insulated. So we were used to color comics. We were used to cheap comics, more importantly. So when Frew is now trying to open up to the world and people are interested, it's the expensive price, but black and white. People also have a certain idea of value addition. When you think my comic is in color, they think, okay, it's worth the price. But when you're paying that kind of money and then you're thinking it's black and white, it's lazy to them. It's a wrong idea. These guys won't hesitate to buy the Batman black and white trade paperbacks. Because to them, that is a different value addition, because that was meant to be black and white, and it has such a huge cast of super creators who are like big names in the industry. So all in all, Frew's black and white is very good for Australia. I have realized that because of looking at the demography and everything of what it caters to. But for the international market, Frew is and Frew should look at the international market now at the world. It is not really very lucrative for the international market. It is only for people who are very hardcore into the Phantom and want to keep this and also want to read in English, because there is a lot of draw for Team Phantom stories, but because it's Swedish, even though it is color, people won't be able to read it. So Frew's, it has that market where they can do the all color Team Phantom translations, and that is actually a market they should look forward.
Sorry, you go, Dan.
I was just going to say, you make a really good point there, Ankit, about the exchange rate as much as anything. Like, I think when Australians or anyone looks to buy Indian comics or anything from India, it's the postage price is the killer, but the actual purchase price, is unbelievably cheap to us. So I guess the production costs of what color comics can be produced in India for much cheaper than what the black and white comic is being produced for in Australia. If we were going to get color comics from Frew, on a regular basis, we're probably looking at doubling the price realistically, because you've alluded to it, Germ, the paper quality. If they were going to be doing color all the time, they'd want to be printing on paper that is up to the task. So I don't think it'd be long before we'd see ourselves paying, that $7 to $8 mark for the fortnightly comic. And I think that's starting to get beyond the fortnightly purchase ability.
How much are you buying the Regal comics from the Frew websites again?
Oh, there's a good markup on that. Yeah, on the Frew website.
Yeah. They're $20 each, I think.
Yeah, about 15,
Because
20
if Regal
bucks.
could sell those direct to you at that price, they won't be even worried right now about, if they can keep publishing the Phantom. Because right now with the pandemic and everything, and our Indian market works a little different. Like we don't have LCSs and all. We get everything from our local newspaper shop and everything. And also most people, like, they walk through and browse and see and they pick something up. And right now, no stand, nothing is keeping Regal, and it's just like a little dismal for people.
Ankit, I think you've touched on a really interesting point here, because you're talking, when we compare the sort of publishing market for Phantom comics in Australia and India, we're talking about a huge difference in economies of scale here. Being able to publish a full colour comic in India is a much more probably economically viable model, just simply given the potential size of the Indian readership audience, which dwarfs anything Australia can ever hope to match. Even at its peak in the early 1950s, I think the Phantom here in Australia was selling perhaps maybe 90 to 100,000 copies at the time, and that was a monthly black and white comic. And, when you look at the size and diversity of the Indian market, where you had publishers like Indrajal and Diamond, who not only were printing in full colour, but they were also able to print in multilingual editions, in Hindi and Bengali and Tamil as well. And also I noticed, when I was doing research on my book, some publishers who are targeting specific language groups, like say Tamil, the prices were kept deliberately low, perhaps, in recognition of the sort of demographic they're going for. So, they might not be in black and white, but they might have one or two spot colouring throughout. And I think the Indian audience for comic books allows, and the size of the market allows companies like Gotham Comics, which you mentioned, which you grew up reading, and that's your first exposure to that then current generation of American comics. You've been able to sort of enjoy the benefits of that because India is such a potentially lucrative readership market. I think and I don't know if Frew has the capacity to do this. It depends on what contractual arrangements they have with King Feature Syndicate in America, who own the copyright and trademark to the Phantom. But if they could actually syndicate, say, the Australian drawn, the Australian created stories to Regal Publishing, and Regal could, produce colorized editions of those stories for the Indian market, I think that would be a really economically viable alternative. You and your friends would be able to enjoy the stories in colour and also in a much more cost-effective way than having to, shell out a huge price for the original Australian printed editions. I don't know if Frew can do that. I don't know if Regal Publishing in India would be interested in doing that. But for me, that would be one way of surmounting that cost barrier, which, as you point out, is significant.
Yeah, I had actually had this idea in my head that what if Frew could do their fortnightly black and whites as much as they want, but whenever they did color and had a special collaboration, when they were doing trade paperbacks or something, they could share the actual print files with Regal or something, and have Regal actually print the whole thing in India, because I think the cost would turn out to be the same. If you think about it, you are actually paying a huge upcharge compared to other comics, because it's just 200 rupees for us. But the quality of paper over there is as good, maybe better than your trade paperback.
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting strategy, Ankit. You could get Frew if they wanted to contract with an Indian printer, and I guess this would probably be easier in a COVID-free world. I don't know how practical it is right now, but if they were to contract, say, the a colour end of year special to be printed in India, and the Indian printer could almost literally produce an Indian market edition, which has a different cover, perhaps, or they could do it. They could sort of splice and dice it and repackage it in a different way for the domestic Indian market, plus also provide the colour edition for the Australian market. Again, logistically, I don't know if that's practical, but yeah, I think depending on what Frew is allowed to do legally, I think there is an opportunity for them to syndicate their Australian drawn stories to, say, India, to Sweden, via Egmont, and to have them syndicated throughout the sort of Scandinavian market as well. I'd love to see that. So that, just in the same way that Australian readers of the Frew edition are being exposed to all these different varieties of Phantom stories, published over many decades from many countries, I think it'd be really great for Frew to showcase some of their Australian drawn stories to the international market as well. And the model that you're suggesting here, I think on paper, just talking about it, sounds really good. It sounds really practical, and I'd love to see it. I just don't know if it's legally possible for Frew to do that. We really need Glenn Ford here to answer all these questions for us.
There has been two stories that have Frew created stories. One by Duncan Munro, which was the Hero Complex story, and Jungle Love, which is in this story as well, by Shane Foley and Pity Anderson. Just trying to find it in here. So this story here, for those who are on YouTube. So those two stories have actually appeared in a Phantom Men comic and a Phantom Net comic. So
great.
The precedence is there. I guess the beauty about that concept is there's no costs of sending a big pile of comics which can get damaged, lost, dog-eared to India. It's literally a WeTransfer zip file, which is, can be done. And to be honest, the way I see it is if Frew send Phantom Men or Team Phantom Men 5 stories, they then send 5 stories back, which then means their readers get an extra 5 stories, and then Frew and then Team Phantom Men don't have to publish an extra 5, or don't have to pay for an extra 5 stories. They only got to, the costs are lower because it's cheaper to publish a story that's already published than it is to get a writer and an artist to do it. So, Ankit, one question I do want to ask you is, we know, it's obvious in talking to you and in talking to a lot of other Indian fans, whether it's on social media or wherever, that colour is important to you Indians. I understand why it's important, but I'm sure there's some listeners out there where they don't understand the importance to colour in your culture. So could you just explain a little bit about why colour is so important to the Indian culture?
Color is important. In a cultural standpoint of view, if you notice, best example is Bollywood. If you just look at Bollywood, it's always we are attracted. It's just like part of something. It's organically part of us. We like the loud, light things, and so that is like maybe an Indian stereotype thing, but there is a little there is always something underlying to these nuances. And when it comes to comics, what happened is black and white comics definitely existed, but when single monochrome comics started coming, like I grew up on one of them, that was like a special page. Like when there was a children's magazine that we used to read, and it had comics like Batul the Great, which is a Bengali strip. So we know those first 2 pages would always be in color, but they weren't like really in color. There was an orange. There were different tints of orange in it. That's it. But that was like a special thing. So we always felt it. And for Indians, you notice another thing. It's another stereotype. I apologize. We love to bargain, like get more out of the money or something like that. So the moment when you have a whole black and white magazine and then like 2 pages in color, like that for $9 I'm still getting those 2 pages. that is the kind of thing. And over time, with books and everything, presentation has become very important. And more importantly, if you look at it in terms of comic consumption, right now, trying to get any American comic, which is the predominant thing, thanks to the Marvel movies and everything, it is always an up challenge. And let me tell you, comic collecting or like reading all of this is a very, very privileged person's lifestyle here. India is a very poor country in general, and comics is like a really huge privilege for a very small fraction of the population. I am part of that. You can afford to buy these things. You can afford to spend that kind of money every month to get these trade paperbacks and everything. That's what. So you must also think of the general readers who just read, consume. They are not the people who also carefully put everything up in their shelves. But to them, that little bit of color puts that value addition. Even if they're going to discard that magazine, it's going to go off and be sold off as scrap someday. But the fact that you're getting it at that price, so price matters, and with price, color matters. So if you're going to give them a black and white comic or something right now, they'll be like, okay, my newspaper is only black and white, and newspaper is cheap. Black and white is actually equated with cheap, if you understand what I'm saying. That is actually a cultural thing, I would say, that it is always price to quality. It is never objectively, even if you give somebody black and white with glossy paper, really well inked and everything, it is still black and white. It is considered bland. And that is the biggest hurdle, things will have in the Indian market if you're trying to push it completely on black and white. Because small time, very few, that there are people who do buy Frew. I know that for a fact. And they are like a minuscule amount, even in the comics fraternity. Everybody, whoever, nowadays who are hooked onto comics, they will obviously buy color. And those who are hooked onto collecting more than just reading, they still have this because they are still in touch with what is more expensive, what is more lucrative, what is like a rare issue and all of that. So to them, that doesn't matter. So those little demographies are like mini little, very small, tiny specks in the big thing. But in the big picture, color for Indians are always important because more than a cultural thing, it is more of a value addition thing.
Yeah, it's very much that question of getting value for money, and I think you're absolutely right there, Ankit. I think for Indian readers who've grown up reading the Phantom, ever since the Phantom was first published in, I think, Illustrated Weekly of India magazine, it was sort of like the big photographic, sort of like India's equivalent of Life and Time magazine. That was printed in colour. They were printing the Wilson McCoy stories in the 50s in colour. When Indradjal Comics is launched in 1964, it's in colour as well. So there's, Indian readers for generations have been accustomed to seeing, domestically produced comic strips and comic books produced in colour. And I think you touched on a really interesting point there when you talk about the perception of value for Indian readers. They will value even a black and white comic that has tints of colour, throughout. They will value that more than, say, something purely printed in black and white. You had a similar kind of schism in Australia between, say, casual comic book readers who grew up reading black and white Australian printed editions of Superman, Batman, etc., throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and the sort of, what you refer to as a kind of small core, almost minority audience of, serious comic book collectors. Here in Australia, those serious comic book collectors would go to specialty comic shops and start buying the imported American comics, which were sold at a higher cover price, because the perception was they were better value because they were in colour, and also because they were the genuine article. They were the American comics printed in colour as they were originally intended, whereas they looked down on the cheaper black and white Australian edition. So I think that perception of value tied to whether something is in black and white or in colour, that was very much evident in Australian comics culture particularly in the 70s and 80s, as more and more imported American comics are becoming available to Australian readers too. So no, it's an excellent point.
It is.
So, Kevin, just following on what you just said then about in the 70s and 80s, with the colour being perceived as a higher value, could that be the same as with the Frew comic now, where black and white can kind of be seen as a cheaper throwaway comic in a sense? So could the Frew comic be perceived as a higher value comic to the Australian market if it was in colour, whether it was every issue or every second or every third or whatever issue?
I think so. I think, the way Frew have been publishing colour editions of the Phantom, they very much framed it as a kind of special edition, like it's a special occasion. It's like, the colorized version of the Sky Band to tie in with Billy Zane's appearance at local comic conventions back in 2019. Or if it's the, end of year annual edition, like what they've just done for the 2021 annual edition, with the reprints of the 4 American strips. I think the fact that they seem to be reserving colour editions for what they would call their sort of landmark or special editions, which would sell at a higher retail price, I think that's possibly one way that they're trying to make the higher cost of a colour edition comic palatable, by saying, look, it's special. It's not just like the average fortnightly issue, which is $3.75 and it's in black and white. Look at this. It's got square bound binding, it's got glossy paper, it's in full colour. So they're trying to perhaps make this more of an occasion, a publishing occasion. And I think perhaps that is a way that Frew can continue to incorporate colour into their publishing schedule without perhaps alienating their sort of core rusted on readership who, perhaps have a preference for black and white, but also they don't want to price themselves beyond the reach of an average reader as well. And I think at $3.75 an issue is still a very affordable reading experience compared to other forms of print media that you can choose from in Australia as well. Yeah. So I think they have to be mindful of that.
That's where part of this conversation, I guess, we were talking in the lead up about, or Jermayn and I were certainly, about the fact that Frew have just produced 2 colour editions consecutively. And one of them, yes, was the last issue of last year, which was a Christmas special with the 3 newspaper stories presented in colour. The next one is, it'll be interesting to see how it goes, because it's not as a special, it's just the fortnightly edition, if you want to say just. That's issue 1883, The Poor People's Plague, which is the Jason Paulus one I was referring to earlier. It will be interesting to see if a lot of people jump on that on the back of, perhaps getting the Christmas special as that once a year gift, or, an uncle found it in his Christmas stocking or whatever.
Yeah.
And then backs it up and then goes, oh, the fortnightlies are in colour too now, and, it re-engages with the comic. So if this is something that, and I guess I mentioned before about the artists themselves, we know that Jason Paulus would prefer to colour his work, and probably does it. I don't know how much more he would charge for the colour version as opposed to the black and white version. Again, that the money talks, and he's obviously affordable, but I guess doing his own stuff too might help and keep the costs down. So I guess it depends a little bit on how the artist is prepared to present it to Frew, and what it's going to cost them too.
Yeah. It depends on how he's being commissioned. Like if he's been commissioned to explicitly produce a colour story, that cost would presumably be built into whatever page rate he's being paid. So they're not paying additional labour costs to have, someone come in and colorise Jason Paulus's black and white line artwork. The fact that he is talented enough to do that, he's a double threat in that regard. I think, makes it cost effective to use an artist like Jason Paulus to do that. We'll wait and see. But I think it's as you say, it's really interesting that they've got a regular fortnightly issue in colour coming hot on the heels of the end of year Christmas special. what will the audience reaction be? I hope it's good. I think Jason Paulus's work really, he's one of those few artists who can do black and white really well, because that's, some of his earliest stuff from the 80s and 90s was printed in black and white. So he's got a good grasp of how black and white artwork works, but also, he's sufficiently, talented an artist to understand how to draw work that is intended for colour reproduction, colour printing as well.
Oh, that's some good points. So, Kevin, we've touched a little bit upon India and how India have always had colour with their comics. I was wondering if you can spend a couple of minutes talking to us a bit about Sweden, because for those who don't know, the Egmont comics, in the up until the early 90s, I believe it was 92, 94, I believe it was, printed all of their stuff in black and white, and then they did the big switch and switched to color. Now, myself and Dan were actually talking to this week. Actually, we were talking to a creator who grew up in that era and grew up with the switch, and it's fair to say the original colours. I've got a story here. So this is Phantom Unmasked, actually, 1992, number 18, and you can see, for those who are on YouTube, for those on audio, you'll just have to listen to my words, but you can see that the colour is not that good. Like there's one instance here where you probably won't be able to see that on YouTube, but the blue of the cow is actually outside the line. It looks like my daughter has coloured it, to be fair. So there was that. It's a lot better now. I think they've got a different colorist, who I think it's like a company organisation that colours it now. And I've got examples here where they've even coloured old stories that were originally published in black and white, and then they've recolored it, and the quality is very, very good. But in your research for the book, did you talk to anyone about the color swap and what the reactions were or anything like that? Sorry,
I did come across a few Swedish readers who took part in my online readers survey about the Phantom and about particularly Phantom in Sweden. And there were probably readers, say, of my generation who grew up reading Phantom in black and white in the 70s and 80s, and they hated the transition to colour. I think, one of them said it was just a dreadful mistake, wished they'd never done it. But again, I think this is a generational thing. You made reference to speaking to a Swedish creator who's grown up with the colour editions of Phantom in the 90s. That's what they're accustomed to. But I think for a certain generation of Swedish readers, that was a period of adjustment, not necessarily a welcome innovation. My understanding was that when Phantom reverted back to colour in the early 90s, a lot of that colouring was actually outsourced to Malaysia. It wasn't actually done in Sweden, so that might explain the disparities in quality. That was eventually, I think, brought back in-house to Egmont and to local colorists, artists, whatever, whoever is responsible for doing that. But it's also important to remember that when Phantom first began publishing in Sweden in 1950 as a monthly magazine, it was printed in full colour. And it was only ceased being in colour around about 1955. I don't know what the reason was behind that. It might have been a cost reason, and then reverted to colour from 1955 reverted to black and white from 1955 up until the early 1990s. So in some respects, Swedish Phantom readers from the mid-50s to the early 90s were in the same position as Australian readers of the Frew Phantom edition. The Phantom was a black and white comic, and when you have Swedish creators who are producing new Phantom stories exclusively for the Swedish and, by extension, Scandinavian market. They are produced for black and white reproduction. You've got artists like Jamie Valve, who's the sort of leading Phantom artist of that era, the 70s. He's very much schooled in that tradition of black and white cartoon art. And I think for a lot of Swedish fans, having grown up with that, when the transition is made to colour and the transition is not as good as you would hope, that leads to disappointment. But I think one of the reasons why the Swedish publishers converted to colour was the Phantom was losing ground in terms of sales. It was just a commercial necessity. Up until, I think, the early 1980s, television wasn't really a commercial threat to comic books in Sweden. There was like maybe 2 channels available to Swedish television viewers. They were broadcasting in black and white. So it wasn't like Australia where you had colour TV broadcasting across 3 commercial networks and 1 state broadcaster, the ABC. So the media market in Sweden was very different. It was almost quite frugal. I remember one Swedish reader saying, we read comics simply because, we didn't have a television for the first 10 years of my life growing up in the 1970s. TV and video cassette recorders and the like weren't a part of daily life for many Swedish households up until the 1980s. That changes in the 1980s. And I remember Ulf Granberg telling me when I interviewed him for my book, he said it really changed in the 80s, especially with popular music. Popular music was the thing that started to drag young Swedish readers away from comics. And he said that every year, as the 1980s began, sales started to drop every year. So I think the decision to go to colour was really driven by commercial necessity. They had to reverse declining sales, hence why they thought, okay, we've got to go to colour. I think the television market in Sweden had been expanded and deregulated, so there was no longer a state broadcaster monopoly there. So they had a lot more competition to deal with, and that's why they probably decided we've got to go back to colour to appeal to a new generation who's used to colour video entertainment.
It's really interesting what you learn on the podcast. Like we spoke to Timothy Boyle and learned that Colonel Gaddafi's demise was responsible for us not getting a second Phantom movie. And tonight I've discovered that ABBA and Ace of Base have led to colour comics in Sweden. There you go.
So, very good, Dan. So I've got a comic here, what you were just talking about. This is Phantom Men numbers 6 to 7 of 2018. I'm showing up a couple of panels for YouTube viewers. This is a George Bess story that was originally created in black and white, and then this is the color. And to be honest, the color of this is really, really good. Like George Bess is an artist who his work, like Jamie Val, works brilliant in black and white. He created those stories for black and white, and he's, probably for a lot of readers, he's like a top 10. They're like top 10 artists and stuff like that. And so the way they've created these panels in color has to be what do you call it? Congratulated for, I guess, for the quality that they did there. So Kevin, I know you probably know the Swedish market better than all of us with your study and all that. If there was a lesson that maybe in your time that you taught to Ulf and such, a lesson that could maybe still be learnt in today, if Frew was to go colour, or if Frew was to follow in their footsteps and stuff like that, what would that lesson be? Would it be is there anything that kind of stands out that maybe, that needs to be, be careful so it doesn't get replicated, or something that they did well, or something they didn't do well? Or
I think what Frew has done in the last few years, it's been a very sort of cautious, dip the toe in the water approach to using colour. They want to test the market and see, is there sufficient audience demand to warrant publishing in colour? And that has to be reflected in the sales. The fact that they have continued to publish intermittently, regular issues and special issues, and even trade paperbacks, I think is really interesting. Trade paperback editions in colour suggests that there is a demand for it, that it is commercially viable for them to do so. And I think the fact that they've used, material that has either that was already produced for colour reproduction, like the recent collection of the US daily strips, which are always printed in colour now. And I think also, I think that's good. And I think, like the example you showed of the George Best story that's been colorized for the Swedish market, I think the way that they did the colorized version of the Sky Band as well reflects that kind of intelligent, thoughtful approach to coloring. I think they've managed to avoid perhaps the initial mistake that Phantom made in Sweden in the early 90s, when the color was not of good quality. And I don't know, perhaps it even compared poorly to imported colour comics that were available to Swedish readers, or whether there were, Swedish language editions of, DC and Marvel comics, and, Swedish readers compare the two and go, oh, the Swedish Phantom in colour doesn't look nearly as good as these colour American comics. So I think the Frew has been fortunate. They've avoided that initial misstep, which I have to point out, Sweden's Phantom series, quickly overcame. I think they realised that, they didn't want to alienate their loyal readers, but they also need to attract new readers. And I think that was a lesson learned very quickly. And I think, their approach to colour, has been really interesting. And also you can see that even in the trends towards using different style of cover art, moving away from the full painted covers of the Rolf Goes, covers from the 80s and 90s, when Mikhail Sol takes over as editor in, the 2010s, we start to see covers which look much more like contemporary American superhero comics, like black and white line artwork, colorized, digitally colored, not full color painting illustrations. So I think they've been very cognizant of trends, international trends in comic publishing, and they've been doing their very best to sort of acknowledge where readers' tastes are going.
Yeah, and I don't think that there'd be I look around the room that I'm in, and most of my Phantom stuff is behind me, stacked in, so it looks like I've got heaps. But I don't have any black and white stuff hanging up on the wall unless it's original art sort of thing, and I don't have much of that. So the vast majority of what surrounds me in my Phantom room is colourful, and I do enjoy looking at the Phantom images in colour, the covers, the posters, that sort of stuff. I guess if we're just talking about in terms of stories, I know I'd be very similar to most people, I would think, in that regard, but perhaps a quantity for your average fan. But anyway, but in terms of the actual stories, I guess I as I sort of said right at the start, I have a greater tolerance for reading them in colour and reading them in black and white and not needing to see them in colour.
Yeah.
All right. Well, any other comments from the that
I
you
was
want to just
say
raise?
I was just going to say that, like, we're talking about how the Phantom quickly did that transition, but if you have you noticed one thing, that Phantom or all these stories that we're talking about, Phantom even now, even with the color palette and everything, even the art style, it is not really as modern as you think. It's very recently that it has crept towards modern. If you look even about 5 or 4, I would say even 3 years back, the art style of the Phantom, the way it was drawn, was still almost like a Silver Age. Like every artist, be it Mr. Jamie Valve or anyone, they were very Silver Age artistic. Paul Mason is one of the ones I would say who is really put a very unique spin and a newer age style. Because if you look at it, the art style, the inking style, the line work style is still very Don Newton, Neil Adams, that era, and of course Cy Berry. It's almost like everybody, whenever they want to put a straight picture of the Phantom, they look at Cy Berry panel and then they try to recreate it. That's not gone away, and that is why I think we haven't really seen it, and because of that, the coloring has also been, as you say, muted, and you're liking these colors because they're complementing the actual art style. These colors will never work if you say commission someone like a Jason Fabok to do a Phantom story, because with Brad Anderson is like the only guy, or even Jim Lee. If Jim Lee does a Phantom story, this kind of color will never fit into that context, because the whole inking style, the whole illumination, and the post color style that they put, as well as the more importantly, I would like to point to the paper quality. A lot of people miss out on the fact that the paper quality is paramount almost on when they think about what they're going to reprint. The paper quality has always been very matte. It is whereas most of the stuff, the trade paperbacks, actually recently it went back to matte. I think that's more because of the pandemic and the price issue. But it has always been glossy, and that is the way they have always painted, considering that there will be a huge lift in the hues and the brightness level and contrast level. So unless we actually start seeing modern art styles, but like guys like Jason and all are doing it. If you see the way they are doing colors, you can understand they are probably doing digital art itself on an iPad and putting that first layer into the color. So we haven't yet seen modern coloring in Phantom. The closest we've come is how Moonstone have produced those books. And it's still kind of, it's very difficult, I have realized, to get out of Cy Berry's aura for most artists. And the closest I have seen is how Sal Belluto's stuff has been colored on Hormiz's own Death in the Forbidden City, because I really like Sal's work. For those who are seeing this, I really like Sal's work because he is like the right balance, and because he's a veteran itself. Another artist I would like to point out is Eduardo Barreto. I don't know if you remember the Sundays that he
Yes.
Yes.
if you look at, they were bringing that, he was bringing in that that modern style slowly. It is very unfortunate he passed away, and those were like the slight highlights I was seeing, where the colors were really coming to form, and then again it went backwards, and that's what has happened, because again Tom Smith's colors on the Sundays by Paul Ryan, again a veteran of the comics industry, he was a little bit of Cy Berry is always going to be there because how he catered to the market, but he was doing it in a very modern manner. And the Sundays especially, because those are the ones which are being reprinted by Regal. I think they're a very good example if you look at how the Sundays colors just changed between Graham Nolan and Paul Ryan. They were like, it was like a tectonic shift if you look at it. The standard flat colors of the Phantom and everything were there, but when Tom Smith starts coloring the Sundays, you start seeing hues, you start seeing gradients, you start seeing line work, the colors irrespective of the line work. There was no line tracing done to give a gradient, like map for where the color is going to be. So that was, I would say, the first thing. And also, if you notice how the hues were different between a night scene and a morning scene, these are modern coloring aspects. The Phantom has never had it, whether it is in the Phantom one or even in the Frew stuff. So there is still a couple of, I would say, I won't say generations, but still a couple of years left for actually Phantom to come back in color with the modern era. Because the modern era of color is something which has completely gone in a different, and colorists now are practically credited as well as the artists now. They have the third credit pretty much, because color itself is a storytelling mechanism if you look at it. And this is the thing. DC and Marvel have been doing this from the late 80s. Colorists became really important, but the Phantom never really did that. We did not import color. This is what you said when you said the artist is doing the colors itself. It is not just a thing about money. I think it's also a thing about seeing a vision. Sometimes an artist who does the artwork is not always the best judge of how his colors are going to be. The best example I can give is Killing Joke. by the Batman Killing Joke is a very good
Yeah.
example. I think the recolor and the color version. Originally, I keep forgetting. Just can't remember the Killing Joke's artist's name, the British artist. Oh my God, what is
Brian Bolland.
Yes,
I think it's here. Brian Bolland. Yeah.
Brian Bolland did the art, and he's a phenomenal artist. Everyone knows that, no doubt. So and the colors were done, I think who did the Watchmen colors? I keep forgetting. I just need to check. I'm sorry. I
It's while you're checking that, I'll just quickly jump in. It's a very good point about the colors, like because I've seen Tom Smith's work and I've seen like he was a very good colorist. He was actually well known for his coloring work as well. So it's an interesting point you make.
Yeah. So John Higgins was the colorist, and he did colors for Watchmen.
Yes.
If you see Watchmen, every panel that 8x8, the way if you've read the comic, you'll see that the colors distinctly shift with the mood of the story. Now, the interesting story is, I'll give you the side-by-side comparison. When the book actually came out, Killing Joke, it's considered a classic and absolutely one of the most must-read comic of all time. One of them. Of all people, Brian Bolland wasn't happy with the colors because he felt like his art was being obstructed by it. But if you read the Killing Joke version of John Higgins, the best way to get the absolute version of Killing Joke because it gives both of them. Whereas in DC, or when they reprinted the deluxe edition, from now on, that is the only edition that's available. Mr. Bolland had learned how to do coloring digitally, and he had requested he wants to do the colors, and he recolored the whole thing. It's great. I won't say it's great. It's just very strange. It's just color. It's like Batman is colored how he is. Joker is colored how he is. So there is no color hue shift with the mood. The only good part I like is in the flashbacks, he used a very muted black and white, which I think could have been inputted in the John Higgins color. Whereas John Higgins is, if you read it, it's a very disturbing story, Killing Joke. And it gets more and more disturbing. There are panels when the freakouts are happening and he goes psychedelic completely. And because the whole story is told about madness, basically, how one bad day can make you mad. So there is a sequence with spoilers, I'm sorry, that Jim Gordon is being put in a carousel and made to go through all the horrors of seeing his daughter shot and the thing. And so what the colorist does is he takes the art of Brian Bolland, which is very pure, very well done, very strong line work, and he just puts colors on it as it's like a TV distorting. So the artwork definitely gets distorted, but for a reader, when he's seeing it, that unease, that feel that he's getting, he really understands what is happening. Similarly, in a Phantom story, I think I read that there was one story, I think, not Witches of Bradworth, there was one where this lady, I can't remember, it was a pretty scary looking story, the lady was drawn like rubber, she was eating chicken, I think it was some vampire story or a werewolf story. It was a Phantom story, I can't remember the exact name.
I think I know the one you're talking about. It was like a story about Red Riding Hood or something like that.
Yeah. The Red Riding Hood, the origin of the Red Riding Hood kind of story, and that story, especially because of the inking, the drama was there. It wasn't just the art. Like a lot of people say, whose art was it?
It was Hans Lindell, I believe it was.
Yeah,
from memory, it was actually the story that when we did the top 10 villain story, that Mikkel actually raised as one of the bad girl or the bad person there was actually one of his favorites. I think it was the Wolf Man of Montarigus, which was published in Phantom Man 11, 1992.
Now that the drama that I'm talking about, that was established in Phantom via inking. Cy Barry does it brilliantly, especially in that. What was the town? I think Bulletstown.
Oh, Bulletstown, yep.
Yeah, so you can see the drama is being built up. But if you look at the way the colors were handled by Phantom and even Frew and everyone, that level of storytelling by color still hasn't come in. Tom Smith is there.
Yeah.
Red
so
was there.
I just want to So what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying the difference between a good colorist and an average colorist is that it adds another layer of storytelling. You've got the story, the words, you've got the line art, but then with the color, it can actually add a third level, I guess, for lack of a better word, of storytelling to the story. And you're wondering whether at this stage the Phantom is missing out on that. So a lot of the color that we do get maybe doesn't have that third level of color. Is that kind of what you're saying, Ankit?
Yeah, I am saying that because exactly that. I'm saying that the third storyteller, that the colorist is, who will set the mood and the way everything goes, is that is what Phantom is missing, and it can be there because if you commission to a person who's a colorist, not just a artist like a penciler or an inker, like even if you realize this, like even in American comics, there is a separate penciler, there's a separate inker, and there's a separate colorist. Whereas if you see most of the Phantom stuff, the artist does the whole bulk of the job. So I necessarily don't think that the one who's doing the pencils is the best judge for how the story would further with the colors. So that is what I'm saying. The Phantom is still missing out that third layer. And that is why I was saying that we are still kind of 10 years behind the actual industry standard for comics in general. Not, Phantom has become very insular, if you get what I'm trying to say. So that is what, behind the comics, we are still kind of behind as a Phantom. And if we need to reach the base of Marvel and DC and those guys, we need to put a little bit more diversity in the artwork and production.
I think, Ankit, you've raised a really interesting point here, how colour, the added dimension of colour, can really enhance readers' perception of a story. And I think, when you look at the colour palette used on Watchmen, it's used in, the colours are very vibrant and they're almost psychedelic, and they're quite flat, but they're used in such a way they really accentuate the sort of psychological drama, the atmosphere and the suspense of the story. And I think when you talk about adding that kind of missing dimension to the Phantom, because the Phantom is such a spectral, ghostly figure, I mean, that's what his name is. He's a ghost. He's the Phantom. He's the ghost who walks. There is perhaps a greater scope for that kind of more dramatic use of colour than perhaps what we've seen. And when you're talking about, current day Phantom stories being kind of 10 years behind the artistic curve of modern comics, I think what's really interesting is how Frew commissioned Paul Mason to do that Kid Phantom story. I think that's a real breakaway effort by Frew to get someone, a younger artist, who's perhaps more attuned to that current style. It's almost cartoony, but that's quite deliberate because the story is pitched towards a younger audience. But I also think the way he used colour in that series, I think, is much more in the spirit of what you think the Phantom should be, that it adds that extra layer of drama, of suspense. It becomes a separate factor in the storytelling as well. And I think that was a really interesting experiment that Frew did with the Paul Mason stories, and props to them for trying to break out of that Cy Barry mold, and come up with an artist and a storyline designed to appeal to younger readers, to bring them into the fold there. I think that's something that we started to see under Mikael Sol's editorship of Phantom in Sweden over the last decade, because he's of that generation. He grew up, his experience of comics growing up in Sweden is very different to that of his predecessors. And I think he was far more willing to experiment with that. And the fact that he was bringing in more outside, external Phantom stories like King's Watch, from America, into the Phantom in Swedish edition, I think is indicative of that. I think the fact that, you've got an artist like Jason Paulos in Australia, has a very distinctive style, quite unlike, say, the sort of classic Cy Barry or Cy Barry influenced style of, say, George's Best, who is certainly one of my favourite European Phantom artists as well. I think his stuff's beautiful. But I think, Jason Paulos is an example where Frew's willing to experiment with an artist whose work kind of breaks out from that mould there. It's not perhaps as overtly cartoony or Bigfoot cartoon style as Paul Mason, but it's very different to what I think a lot of Australian readers are accustomed to. I'm really hoping that, that local audiences in Australia are responsive to Jason Paulos's take on the character. I think he's an enormously talented artist. I think he does great work, and I've really enjoyed many of the stories. I haven't seen all the ones he's done, but what I've seen, I've really enjoyed so far. So perhaps we're starting to see that kind of trend now, that Frew is willing to take those risks, to do that kind of experiment, the sort of thing that you think the Phantom should be doing. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, just to speak, I guess, to Ankit's point about the extra layer or the third storyteller that the colorist can be. I've dug up some postcards that I got, unofficial Phantom products, but a Canadian fan and color enthusiast, Guy Poisson, a friend of the podcast, he put together, and he is a traditionalist, but he loves recoloring old postcards. So I'll just hold that one up for you to see as an example. How even on the old Wilson McCoy image, he's got this is a Mr. Walker and Devil, and the way that he's coloured fog through the picture. There's another one here of Bill Legante's The Phantom in the Skull Cave, and again the colour of the fire is quite vibrant. And even Ray Moore, quite an old, obviously, and classic.
Oh, wow.
But beautiful sunset behind the Phantom standing up on the skull there, and that really the mood of that particular scene. So I guess if we were to see that sort of level of colour for an entire book, I mean, that would just be mind-blowing, wouldn't it?
That's really great. I love that Ray Moore image that you're showing there. It reminds me almost of those weird lenticular cards that had that kind of 3D effect, like you used to get in packets of Weet-Bix, like the dinosaur cards, the sort of 3D effect there. He's really captured that in that Ray Moore thing. And that's something I wouldn't have thought would work well with a Ray Moore story being originally conceived for black and white newspaper production.
Here's another one that he's done, which is, again, a classic scene. Sala being left in the desert and watching the camels go away. What the colorist has added is the night sky and the stars, and and it adds to the sense of loneliness in that particular picture. So a good colorist, a really high quality colorist, can make a big difference.
Yeah, that's astonishing. I would not have thought that kind of sophisticated color palette would work on what I would call a very basic, straightforward illustrative style like Ray Moore's was. But that really pops. That's just astonishing to look at. Yeah. Hell, I'd pay $20 for that.
I'll give you guys details, mate.
Yeah.
Hopefully I'll have some spares for you.
Just wanted to, while we're talking about colour and a style, and then also talking about Mikkel's soul, there was a story that was created called Blood Rain. Now, this has been published in Frew as well as Phantom Man. So it was published in Phantom Man in issue 24, 2018. I am just going to share my screen and just kind of give you a bit of a look at that. So just bear with me while I do that. If you're audio only, we're just going to flick through this story. So can you guys see this? So this is kind of like adding where you are talking about. So this is a story. So it's actually, what I might do is I might kind of go to that. So it's very normal in the sense that, this is Sal Valuto. It's very normal style. But then what happens is you're having Blood Rain, which is red rain in a sense. And so what they've actually done is, hang on, sorry, it's not really working. Let me try this again. So they've actually, here we go. So in some parts of the story, when the red rain comes down, the color of the comic is red.
Yes.
So I think that's a Phantom example of where the colorist has probably added to the story. And then when this was published in the Frew comic, and Dan, we talked about this when we reviewed it. I don't think the black and white version of this did it justice when you're looking at this, because you couldn't tell that, you knew that the rain was red, but it didn't have that impact.
No, you're right. And for a story like that, which hinged on the color of the rain, it's in the title. It certainly was much more effective in color, as you're showing us here. But again, it speaks to does color actually add to the story?
And I think in this case it does.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, look at that panel. That's great. The color becomes a character in the story. It really does, and it's really accentuated when it flicks back to the present day, which is in the full color, the sort of normal color scheme, and then I presume the red rain sequence is told as a flashback. And it's just drenched in this blood red palette. I mean, that's really striking. I think definitely that's a story that deserved really to be reprinted in color, in English translation rather than black and white. Yeah, it's like watching a sound movie, but you've just turned the audio off. It's like you're missing an integral part of the story there. So I think that's a really good example, I think, of what Ankit is talking about here, where color becomes an integral part of the story. It's not just color for the sake of decoration, but it's something that really guides the reader's perception of the story and influences their reactions to the story as well.
I think maybe, and one thing Frew would be conscious of, it's a book that you mentioned earlier, Jermayn. One of the new Frew crew's first forays into colour was Full Circle by Lou Manor, and it was across 2 issues. I don't have a copy with me. I'm sorry I don't, but you're absolutely right with that book, Germ. The colour was so saturated it almost became muddy, and it was whether the paper quality, it was absolutely to do with the paper quality that Frew were printing on, but the colour was so thick and dark, and similar to what some of those pages of Blood Rain could come out like on poor quality paper too. Like, we've just enjoyed it in a clear PDF, but you've got to imagine the newsprint type paper that sometimes Frew prints on, and how the colours just bleed through. So there is there's an extra cost in that regard to being able to do the colorist's work justice.
But in saying that, would you say that the Christmas issues of those stories are muddy? Because it's the same paper.
Yeah, a little bit. Okay. Yeah, they're certainly nowhere near, again, they're nowhere near as Christmas. You can read them on comicskingdom.com. Yeah,
and it's not like, for instance, oops, I'm losing stuff. It's not like the colours you're going to get in the Frew trade paperbacks.
Correct.
Where
that's right.
It's the paper's quality, which Ankit said. A good example of that is, this is a Moonstone trade paperback. Now, I've said before the podcast, Moonstone, for me, I was a younger fan. It really showed me the potential of what colour could do for the Phantom, looking at the Moonstone stuff. But in these colours in this trade paperback, which is cheaper paper than what it originally was printed on, is not as sharp as what it was. So I think I mean,
that will be the next thing, I guess. If Frew does suddenly print everything in colour, it's like anything. People will say, I want slightly better. And once you get better, you're like, okay, that's good. It'll hold you for about 5 minutes before you start going, oh, what's the next thing? What's the next improvement? So if Frew does go suddenly like that 1992 decision by Tim Phantom to go all colour, if Frew did that, then it wouldn't be very long at all before people are starting to say, hey, come on, let's improve the quality of the paper so that we get a better product. And again, that's where that price will just keep going up. And at what point do Frew price themselves out of the market, or do they have to reduce to being monthly again instead of fortnightly? What impact does that have on their overall business model? So, there's a lot of decisions that go behind, a lot of factors and a lot of variables that go behind the decisions that the Frew Group have got to make.
I think that's a really good point, because what I think Team Phantom and the Swedish edition of Phantom has to their advantage is they have automatic access to the broader Scandinavian market. So they're not just reliant on domestic sales in Sweden. For years they could have their work syndicated to Norway, Denmark, and Finland, and also into other European countries. At the time, Germany, I think for many years was an export market. West Germany, as it was then, was an export market for, Phantom and stories and Phantom stories generally. So Semic Press, as it was then, was in an enviable position. They weren't just reliant on one domestic market. They had an entire region that they could syndicate their work to. They could also syndicate their work to India, which they did with Egmont India in the early 90s as well. And they also had Australia as a new export market from the mid-1980s onwards. So they've been able to offset a lot of their initial production costs, their sunk production costs of commissioning a writer, artist, colorist, whatever. They can recoup those costs and profit by virtue of being able to syndicate their work through many different markets around the world. Frew has never had really that option available to them. I think only until recently, where we've seen some of the Australian drawn Phantom stories appearing in Phantom in Sweden. And I think if that happens, that's great. That's got to be economically beneficial for Frew. And if that helps them offset production costs of, full color printing, great. That'd be really good.
The suggestion of the PDF transfers and whatever to India, and maybe working with Regal and getting them to, a little bit of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. They get the comic for a reduced price. We get the coloured version straight away. And so the first time even Frew readers said it's in colour because of that arrangement. It'd be fantastic to see something like that, and that might be a way forward that's economically viable.
Yeah, I think the scope for syndication and reproduction of different Phantom stories across different markets now has never been technically easier. Yeah. It's whether it makes sense, and it also depends on what contractual arrangements different publishers have with King Features licensed representatives in those countries. Regal in India, may have certain conditions placed on their publishing contract which might prevent them from doing, reproducing Frew stories. But I think, here are two markets which are proven, grounds for the popularity of the Phantom. If that's possible, if Frew can get Australian drawn stories published in Sweden, that sets a precedent. I'd love to see that kind of similar transfer occur between Frew and, say, Regal in India, because then Indian readers would be able to, enjoy the benefit of these stories at a fraction of the price, and we get the colour, printing trade-off as well. So let's hope this podcast reaches the right ears, okay? And then they remember this was our idea.
When Dan said about the paper thing, that the paper gets better, then what? This is exactly an issue that I know Regal is facing right now. Regal was doing really good. The paper quality was good, but it was matte in the first two issues. In the 3 and 4, they increased the GSM on the matte. It was still very good, but then they made this Christmas special of 5 and 6, and they went to gloss with 90 GSM, and that has kind of become like a point of no return now for them, because it was so big and so well received that they cannot go back. But unfortunately, this this situation is such that there has been like almost a 30% upcharge on that exact paper thing. So, and the thing is, and they can't increase the price because they are still stuck on the 200. So they are kind of like really stuck in a situation where if they go back, people will be like, what? And if they don't carry on with this, they're going to take a hit with their thing. So I really don't know how they're going to, because I know for a fact that they are really contemplating about what to do with it. But they are going to stick with the gloss paper, but it's going to come at a big price for them.
So clearly there's such a thing as being too successful.
All right. So what we're going to do, has anyone got any final points they want to raise or something? And then I've got a bunch of final questions, and there's going to be short answers to end off the podcast. So if you've got a point you want to make, this is your time to make it. Kevin?
No further points. I'm done. This has been a fascinating discussion. I've really enjoyed it.
Ankit, you got any final points you want to make?
I would like to say one thing. The reason why I advocate for color so much is not for me per se. The reason I advocate for color, I'm looking at the fact that the Phantom as a character is, I'm 32, I'm not really young, I might look a little different, but the deal is not. I am still 32, which is practically going towards middle age. But if I look at somebody in India right now who's like 13, 14, and especially now with so much different thing from video games to people having apps and iPads coming in, reading habits are going down. So when they're going to read something, there is going to be a lot more to do with it. People are coming back to comics because of movies. So unless King Features also starts really putting the Phantom brand out there with its visibility, like for me, like I tell you, another great thing about me, why the Phantom was relevant was when I was, I think, 9 or 10 years that old, 94, 95, that point of time, Phantom 2040 hit the scene. And immediately after that, Defenders of the Earth was screened. So you had like a continuity there. So that period of my life, I was, there was still something else. Like I was not reading Phantom comics then, but I was watching Phantom 2040 as a thing constantly. And, that's one of the reasons why in my head, I really wish there was like a comic spin-off and they still have like a series for Phantom 2040, because I really think that is something that works. Because right now, all the comic companies have alternate universes and they're heavily marketing them. Like DC is right now doing with Futures End, which Andrew Constant is writing Nightwing Futures End. I don't know if you know. And Marvel is now again pushing something which they did in the 90s, Marvel 2099, then Spider-Verse. So all of these. So the Phantom 2040 is something which is very easy to put in contemporary view. So bringing that back in, say, like a comic series or even merchandise, anything, or toys. Like, can you imagine after in 2021 we have toys right now? Like after so many years, we have proper action figures, and I don't want to go in there because I'm also an action figure nut. I collect them, and if you, and by the way, you think people are nitpicky about the Phantom in black and white? Wait till you see toy collectors get these, and then they're gonna raise hell about accessories, sculpt, and they're going to like rip it apart. I'm telling you. And that, so this is the reason. The reason I'm talking about color is just another step forward, but it is just one step. If we want to keep the Phantom relevant and because we are falling back as the whole like HBO Max and Marvel Unlimited and all of this, Disney Plus is coming in, the Phantom is going to fall back. The comics are going to fall back. No matter how good your stories are or whatever it is, the new generation won't go up and pick it up on a comic store. And for that, you will have to do these marketing changes. Color is just one part of the puzzle. And that is why it also rests on people like the publishers. What are they doing with the license? It's not just about comics. It's Frew doing something else. Like now we have a game board or something. Is somebody going to make a video game for the Phantom? Are they going to make a movie? Something, anything like that.
Yeah.
Actually, can I just jump in on that point that you made, Ankit? I think it's really interesting. You talked about, the Defenders of the Earth cartoon and Phantom 2040. The problem with the Phantom is that he doesn't have a lot in the way of gadgets. In some respects, he's quite an old-fashioned hero. He rides around on a horse. You know, he's got 2 guns, you know, 2 Colt 45s. He's a very low-tech kind of superhero character, whereas Batman, who is mortal, like the Phantom, has a lot of high-tech gadgets, you know, Batcopter, Batmobile, whatever, and you can easily market and duplicate those as toys, as spin-off merchandise. The one thing that was really interesting about Defenders of the Earth is that you saw this new line of Phantom merchandise come out. I think there was even like the Phantom flew a special, you know, skullcopter, you know, futuristic helicopter, and they made a really impressive toy of that. We don't see, you're quite right, we don't see enough of that kind of, not just the prestige collectors market figurines or action figures, you know, catering for the sort of high-end collector, but for, you know, kids, you know, going into a department store or a toy store, who see, you know, all these Batman and Superman action figures. Where's the equivalent of the Phantom? And I think this is something that King Feature Syndicate has struggled to do for decades with the Phantom. They have never been able to find the right licensees who can develop the kind of merchandise, the sort of mass market merchandise, which keeps the Phantom in the public eye to the same extent that, you know, Batman toys have kept Batman in the public eye since the 1960s TV series with Adam West. Every time there's a new Phantom film Batman film franchise, there's like a tsunami of Batman toys, which literally floods the market. And that is what keeps the character in the public eye, especially amongst younger audiences who don't read comics, who aren't exposed to the comics. I think the Phantom really suffers from that merchandising deficit there. I think you've hit on a really key point there, Ankit. We need another Phantom 2040. We need another Defenders of the Earth.
The funny thing is, right now, even it's not just toys when the movies come out. McFarlane toys, they are bringing out when comic arcs are coming out, and people who don't read comics, they are looking at the great, great design and this and that, and they are buying comics just to be the backdrop for their display.
Yeah.
Selling both. That's the thing.
Yeah.
That's why I think, you know, this color and everything is just that upgrade to that point.
It's just one aspect of a larger issue. Yeah.
We're only going to be able to solve one. We're only going to try and solve one problem in this podcast, and that's colour, not merchandise and King Features. That's something that we've been has been a huge bugbear of myself and on this podcast for a while. Dan, have you got any comments you want to raise before I get into my final questions?
It would be interesting to know, and obviously they've got an entire universe, but what percentage of Star Wars income has come from the merch? Every movie, there's so many toys. I reckon we go straight into the final questions, Jermayn. And what are these? Are going to be like 5 words or less answer for each question?
Yes. So 5 words, yes, no type of question. So, Dan, you first. Will colour generate new younger readers for Frew comics?
Yes.
Kevin?
Yes.
Ankit?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Where to for Frew? Do they do a mix of black and white or colour, or stick with what they're doing? Ankit?
Mix of black and white and color, because they're a business. They have to cater to their audience.
Yeah. Okay. And then also on follow-up, what's the ratio? Like 1/3 of colour to 2/3 black and white? So
I would say get rid of things like the Phantom's World and annuals and all of that. Put more trade, like 3 trade paperbacks a year would be great.
Yeah, that's actually going to be my point when we review the annual coming up. So yeah, Kevin.
I would like to see a mix. I think if they can have 2/3 black and white and 1/3 colour, if it's commercially viable, and that mix, you know, results in greater sales, then yes, by all means, they have to do it. And I for one would welcome it. I think it'd be a chance to bring in new material into the franchise, which, you know, perhaps we haven't been able to see before, simply because it was originally published in colour.
Dan?
Yeah, I think we're probably on a progression now, and we'll get to that 1/3, 2/3 ratio, but I think we'll go past that. And whether it's in 5 years, that's probably best case scenario if you're a colour advocate, or maybe 10. Everything will be in colour except maybe the replicas, which will be the touchstone for the traditionalists, and that's probably about when we'll finish the countdown of the 200 replicas too. So yeah, that's where I see the future, I suppose.
Okay. Now the next question: user now in charge of Frew. Okay. Would you colour the newspaper reprint stories, Dan?
The reprints.
So if you were to reprint newspaper stories like the Skyban or the Skyban, would you only print them in colour, or would you do them in black and white?
I'd do them in colour if there was a cheap version available. I probably wouldn't pay someone to colour it for me.
Okay. Kevin?
Tricky question. It depends on the artist and the story. I think the Wilson McCoy stories probably lend themselves to colour more so than the Ray Moore. Wilson McCoy had a simpler, bolder style, a much more open line style. So even the dailies that he drew in black and white, I think would lend themselves to colour better than the Ray Moore stories. Likewise with Cy Barry, even though his daily black and white episodes, are incredibly strong, I think his style is sufficiently open and crisp that it lends itself to colouring in a way that the Ray Moore stories simply can't. Having said that, those cards that you showed us earlier from your Canadian friend, the sort of bootleg Phantom cards, they're impressive, but I don't know if that's sustainable to do for reprinting an entire Ray Moore story. So I'm more open to the idea of colorizing older newspaper strips than I was, say, 5 or 10 years ago.
Okay. Ankit?
Personally, I would look at it this way. The way I would not do anything from the eras of McCoy and them, that they are out. Only from the Barry era, colored, and I would not put them as daily thing. I would put them in trade paperbacks, almost like specials for Cy Barry, like selected stories which have like a common theme between them. In that way, you get all the daily stuff out very fast, and also you get readers to get like a complete story saga which is loosely based on each other with consistent art and consistent look. And Cy Barry was so ahead of his own time, I would say, that even now the way he does layouts and the way he does all the panels, it can easily move like a modern comic and everything. And I think that would be a good lucrative thing, because you can market that not just to the Australian readers, you can market that internationally anywhere, because it becomes like a solid story. The dailies are that.
Okay, cool. All right. Last question.
What's your answer to that, Jim?
Sorry?
What's your answer to that?
I haven't been thinking about my own questions. I've been trying to keep this podcast on track. I think colour will generate new younger readers, but like what Ankit said, I think it can't just be, that's not just the sole question, the sole answer. Comics isn't just the sole answer. There needs to be more than just a colour comic for the younger readers. With Frew, I think, in my opinion, if I was in charge of Frew and I had the colour black and white conundrum, I would, now this is just what I would do, I would get rid of the annual and I would do an extra trade paperback, because I think the annual is a little bit old-fashioned, and I love the idea, the concept of the annual, but just reprinting stories in black and white with a new cover, which is something that a lot of readers have already seen. So for instance, the Cy Barry one, the one that's just recently come out, if that was all reprinted in colour, I think it would be a lot more appealable to the newer readers, but also to the crusty old, rusted old fans like us, because we'll be like, oh wow, this is in colour. I want to have a look at it. I'm not going to open my annual. My annual is going to stay sealed and it's going to be filed away. If it was in colour, I would open it up and have a read of it.
It's just to let everyone know, the 2021 annual costs $17.50 for 244 pages black and white. How much would you be prepared to pay for 244 pages color?
Okay,
Wow.
so for instance, this trade paperback that I'm looking at, which is the number 2, this was $30.
Yep.
And it's 200 odd pages, and it was in full color.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay.
You know, sorry, what were you going to say, Kevin?
No, this is really interesting what Frew's doing, moving into the sort of trade paperback market. If you go back and look at the history of how Phantom and comics were published in Sweden back in the 70s, they were splicing and dicing them in all sorts of different formats. You had the fortnightly magazine, but there were also paperback book collections. There were special edition series just devoted to the Cy Barry stories, reprinted in colour. So they're obviously trying to package, putting old wine into new bottles, as it were. And I think, if the example has been the Cy Barry annual that's just come out in Australia being done in colour, that would have been a really interesting example of that. I think if Frew, I don't know if their trade paperbacks were sold just in newsagents or whether they were trying to hit the bookstore market as well and libraries. I think if they want to expand their retail presence, like in terms of the number of sales channels they want to go to, then I think publishing more book-style publications, even if they wanted to go to back in the mid-80s, what Budget Books did. They had those 2 collections of Cy Barry stories there, and they actually came up really well. You had complete stories, the reproduction was good, the stories were unedited, uncensored, and they actually, cast what the Frew product was back then in a fairly poor light, because you got this nice colour cardstock paperback book landscape format, which really lent itself to showing off the Cy Barry stories. And people would go, oh, wow, this is actually quite special. This is pretty good. I think if Frew wants to continue experimenting with these different kinds of publishing formats to see which one works in which different market, I think that's only a good thing. And I think the fact that they're going for glossy trade paperbacks as well as, your fortnightly black and white magazine, I think it's a really positive development. I hope they continue to succeed and experiment with that approach.
Well, ironically, one of the stories I distinctly remember reading in the Budget Books was The Mysterious Ambassador. And that's the first story in the 2021 annual special. So there you go.
There you go.
I agree. I'd say the Budget Books print quality and size, because of the format, is probably a better way to tell the story.
Yeah, absolutely. It's tailor-made to reproduce the daily strip artwork in a really good size, so you really get to savor Cy Barry's artwork and in a crisp reproduction. And it's not a deluxe format; it's just increased just by a fraction the sort of production level. You don't have to commit to a glossy, full color, all singing, all dancing trade paperback to repackage older stories in a new and compelling way. So I think if they continue to do that and it proves successful for them, more power to Frew for doing so.
All right, so just to finish what I was saying, if I was, this is just me,
Tim.
I would just have your regular issues, and then I would have, say, 20 to 25 of them, and then I would have more trade paperbacks. That's how I would do it. And then that way you've got your regular issues, which are in your black and white, and then you've got your trade paperbacks and your special issues, which are in colour, and that way they can go in bookstores. Not sure how they'll go in newsagents, but they're also comic book shops and stuff. So that's how I would do it. Now, one more question for all of yous.
Are we back to 5 words or less?
Yep, 5 words or less.
That's really worked so far, hasn't it?
Well, it did for a little bit. And this is as a reader, not as an owner of Frew, would you be happy with less free comics a year if you had more colour comics? Ankit, I know your answer, so I'll go with you first while the others think.
Yeah, I would be very happy because, to be very honest, it doesn't really bother me But if I'm putting myself in the shoes of an Australian reader and a very fervent Phantom fan, and I'm guessing who all the subscribers are in the 50-60 age group, I think they would want more comics for less comics and color. They would get furious. They'll probably cancel their subscriptions. So as an Australian, no. As an Indian, yes.
Very good answer. Kevin?
No, I don't think I'd be willing to make that trade-off. I like the fact that every 2 weeks there's a new Phantom comic there. I like the fact that in the space of a month or a month and a half, you'll see 3 separate issues available for you to choose from. I like that regularity. I like that frequency. I guess I am probably being a bit old-fashioned in that regard, but when I was back in Melbourne in the latter half of last year, being able to go to a news agency, and pick up, a new Phantom comic every second week, it was just like, oh, I've missed this, because in America, no one knows who the hell the Phantom is, except for, diehard minority audience. But, that the ability to do that, I think, is such an important part of Australian Phantom readers' life that I think, there would be serious withdrawal symptoms if they cut back to a monthly schedule to be like,
Definitely. Dan,
that's my answer.
That's the longest 5 words ever.
sorry.
No, it's good.
I'm not surprised you felt like that though, Kevin, because while you were in Melbourne, probably you're only allowed outside once every 2 weeks.
That's right. It was pretty much. It was like a prisoner being able to walk the yard, once every 2 days. It was like.
I would agree, though. I would say no. I think that the frequency is really important for reasons we mentioned a little while ago about the diversity of stories. Yes, Frew has got a history through the 80s and prior, I suppose, of massive regular reprints, and you're seeing the same stories and the same style of stories all the time. But in the last 5 years, we've seen such a diversity of stories, and we would never have seen those if we were only producing like a Marvel or a DC 6 issues a year. How horrendous would that be?
Yeah.
To go down to those levels for color, no, not worth it. The variety of stories, the frequency of stories, the sheer volume of stories, I really enjoy that, and so no.
Our comics and news podcasts will be a lot shorter.
Wouldn't they? I wouldn't get to talk to you as often, Jim.
That could also be a benefit. All right, guys. Well, I really appreciate your time tonight. We're on about 2 hours.
What was your answer to that one?
I have to admit, I'm probably with yous. And this is why I would just do 25 or 26 or whatever the number is, regular issues, like 36-page ones, and then have your separate line, which is all your color stuff. And then that way, you've got, say, 3 or 4 of these out a year, every quarter. Something like this would be amazing. And then that way, and one of them could purely just be, Ray Moore reprints or Wilson McCoy reprints, and they're done in color, or Cy Barry ones, and then that's how I would do it in a perfect.
You want
world.
to have your cake and eat it too, don't you?
Of course.
Don't we all?
Yeah.
You probably need 2 editorial panels for this, like one panel which is working for those quarterly issues and one panel just doing that would raise costs also.
Yeah, and I don't know, that's how I would do it, but I'm not in charge of Frew. We just help run the podcast, so we get to do all these pipe dreams.
Not bound by anything like the reality.
Yeah, or a mortgage or something like that. So I just want to say thanks, guys. I really enjoyed tonight. I learnt a lot, learning about comics from outside of the Phantom, but also from a Sweden and Indian point of view as well. So on behalf of myself, guys, I really enjoyed you guys joining us. So is there anything anyone wants to quickly say or anything like that, and then we'll do the outro?
No, just wanted to say thank you again for having me on the podcast. It's a pleasure as always. Ankit, it's lovely to have met you for the first time. Thank you for sharing your insights. Because one of the things I was really conscious of when I was working on my book was that I wasn't hearing enough, as many voices from Indian readers as I would have liked. And that was just because the logistics of doing a survey. So having this firsthand, knowledge and insight from you, speaking on behalf of the entire Indian people, no pressure, is great. So thanks. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, great stuff. Let's hope Regal is listening and Frew is listening, and they get to take our suggestions on board. Thanks, guys.
And I would like to really thank all of you for having me with you guys here, and Kevin, who's literally a historian, and you guys are I feel very humbled when because in Phantom realm I'm like Quran, I would say. It's not my stature, but yeah, my stature is kind of like Quran compared to you guys, and I learn so much every time I see, especially because, to be very honest, you guys have a lot more richer publishing history of the Phantom in terms of just what is out there, and learning about the Swedish side and this. I learned so much almost every time, and it's a huge honor for me because I used to always, for years, Chronicle Chamber, I used to just watch it, the videos of the trades, and I never imagined I'd be here one day. And it's a thing for me. So thank you so much for having me over. Thank you so much.
No worries. Dan, did you learn anything tonight, mate?
Yeah, plenty of stuff, and again, I just ABBA and Ace of Base. Who would have thought that they? No, Ankit, I wanted to say thank you to you as well, and you're very generous with your words. We're just a couple of blokes who have too much time on our hands to talk about Phantom, so don't feel like it's that. But I think you've been very magnanimous in not mentioning the cricket one time this entire podcast. So thank you very much. Your team was magnificent over here and taught us a lesson, and I've learned from you tonight as well, mate, in terms of what you've been able to share and some of your insights. And Kevin, as always, I loved reading your book and have referred to it many times since for a variety of things. And I've been enjoying your work on Facebook lately, although I'm getting a bit worried about your influence on Tommy Hughes's legacy.
Look, for those who are watching this, yes, I have been going slightly crazy on the Comic Swipes Facebook page, discovering how Frew in the 70s and 80s were basically lifting a lot of Swedish Phantom N cover designs for the Australian edition there. And it's not to have a go at Tommy Hughes, because I actually would really like to know what Tommy Hughes actually did, because I don't think we've ever understood what his role was as art director at Frew. And I think he probably did a lot of everything. But I think when people say he's responsible for producing all those covers over all that time, I think if you look at the diversity of cover styles and whatever, it's just like, this can't be one guy.
It was almost like he must have been in charge of putting the blue background behind whatever.
Yeah, pretty much. He was probably like the production manager and art director. Yeah. But yeah, I just find it fascinating, going through these Swedish Phantom N covers and the Fratelli Sparta covers and going, wait a minute, that was used on that Frew cover and that one. So yeah, for those of you who want to plunge down a rabbit hole, Comic Swipes on Facebook, look for me.
I don't think we'll ever know with Tommy being dead now, and Smythe and Richardson and all of those guys from Frew. Those are probably stories that are lost to time, unfortunately.
Yeah, sadly so. But hey, you never know. Someone may pop up on Facebook and say, "Oh, I used to have beers with Tommy all the time." And we live in hope.
If that happens, we'll get them on the podcast for sure.
That's it.
You betcha.
That's it. But that's the podcast for another time. So thank you, everyone, for listening to us. As we said before, our website is chroniclechamber.com. Our email address is chroniclechamber@gmail.com. If you have an opinion, you can comment on this podcast on social media. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, and we're on Twitter as well. If you want to subscribe to us, you can subscribe to us on iTunes or Spotify or other apps like Podbean, Player FM, Castbox, or YouTube, of course. So a thank you to everyone who has listened to us. We hope you enjoyed that. We hope you have had an interesting time thinking about the Phantom and colour. And if you have an opinion, make sure you jump on social media and let us know what your opinion is, especially if those quick fire questions that we had towards the end. We'd love to know your opinion on those as well. And if you're on social media, you can use more than 5 words. So from myself, I want to say thank you, Dan, Kevin, and Ankit. Always a pleasure talking to you, gentlemen. For myself, thank you, listeners, and thank you, guys, and everyone. Happy Phantoming.
Happy Phantoming.
Happy Phantoming.
Piracy, injustice and cruelty, and all my sons will follow me, so evildoers will believe that this man cannot die. The Phantom, the ghost who walks. The Phantom, enemies beware. The Phantom's always there, but you won't find the Phantom